May 17th, 1943, 28 past midnight, Möhne Dam, Germany. Wing Commander Guy Gibson pushed the Lancaster into a shallow dive, dropping toward the reservoir at 240 miles per hour. Through the cockpit glass, the dam materialized from darkness. A massive curved wall of masonry, 131 feet high and 112 feet thick at its base, holding back 140 million tons of water. Searchlights swept across the bomber's approach. Tracer fire began arcing upward from flak positions in the dam's towers. Beneath the fuselage, suspended in specially modified bomb cradles, a 9,250-pound cylindrical weapon spun at 500 revolutions per minute. The backspinning created a gyroscopic effect that fought the Lancaster's flight controls, requiring constant correction. Navigator Pilot Officer Torge Terum called altitudes from the nose, 70 feet, 65, 60. They had to be at exactly 60 feet, traveling at precisely 232 miles per hour, releasing the weapon at exactly 425 yards from the target. Any deviation meant failure. Too high and the bomb would shatter. Too low and it would sink immediately. Wrong speed and it wouldn't bounce the required 7 times across 800 yards of water. Wrong distance and it would miss the dam entirely or explode harmlessly against the torpedo nets. Behind Gibson, 8 more Lancasters waited their turn, each carrying an identical weapon that had been fully tested exactly 4 days earlier. They were attempting something never done before, destroying massive engineered structures with a weapon that existed only because one eccentric engineer refused to accept that physics made his idea impossible. This is the story of Operation Chastise, how desperation produced innovation, how mathematics defeated masonry, and how 133 airmen in 19 modified bombers fought a single night that would become legend. It's about the science of destruction, the engineering of precision, and the human cost of turning theory into fire and flood. Barnes Wallis was not a typical weapons designer. Born in 1887, trained as an engineer, he had spent his career designing airships and aircraft structures. By 1942, as assistant chief designer at Vickers Armstrong, he was supposed to be focused on bomber development. Instead, he was obsessed with dams. The obsession began with strategic analysis. Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, depended on hydroelectric power and water from massive reservoir dams. The Möhne Dam alone provided 75% of the water for the Ruhr's industry. The Eder Dam controlled water levels for Germany's canal system. The Sorpe Dam was critical for Ruhr water supply. Destroy these dams, Wallis calculated, and German war production would collapse. But dams were nearly indestructible targets. The Möhne's construction was formidable, a gravity dam using 140,000 cubic meters of masonry, its base 112 feet thick, tapering to 25 feet at the crest. It was designed to withstand any conceivable attack. Conventional bombing from altitude was futile. A direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb would barely scratch the surface. Torpedo attacks were impossible due to defensive nets extending 150 feet into the reservoir. Wallis understood that destroying the dam required exploiting its weakness, underwater pressure. An explosion against the dam's face, beneath the water surface, would create a shock wave that would crack the structure from within, but delivering an explosive charge to that precise location seemed impossible. His solution emerged from childhood memories of skipping stones across water. If a bomb could be made to skip across the reservoir surface, it would avoid the torpedo nets, strike the dam face, sink while remaining in contact with the structure, and detonate at the optimum depth for maximum damage. In April 1942, Wallis committed his theory to paper in a document titled Spherical Bomb Surface Torpedo. The concept was elegant. A spinning spherical bomb, dropped at high speed and low altitude, would bounce across water, much like a stone, until striking its target. The mathematics were complex but compelling. Initial tests in his back garden involved bouncing marbles across a water tub. When the marbles behaved as predicted, Wallace progressed to larger-scale experiments. By December 1942, he was conducting trials at Chesil Beach, Dorset, dropping prototype bombs from modified Wellington bombers. The challenge was enormous. The bomb needed sufficient weight to penetrate deeply upon sinking, but light enough to bounce effectively. It required precise backspin to maintain stable flight and proper contact with the dam wall. The release parameters, altitude, speed, distance, had to be exact, and it all had to work at night, under fire, flown by crews with minimal training time. Wallace's calculations showed that a 9,000-pound bomb with 6,600 pounds of Torpex explosive dropped from 60 feet at 232 miles per hour with 500 RPM backspin would bounce approximately 7 times before contacting the dam. It would then sink and detonate at 30 feet depth, the optimal pressure point for fracturing the masonry structure. The theoretical physics were sound. Convincing the Air Ministry to build the weapon and risk precious bombers on an untested concept would prove far more difficult. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, read Wallace's proposal in January 1943 and wrote a terse assessment. "This is tripe of the wildest description. There are so many ifs and buts that there is not the smallest chance of it working." Harris's skepticism was understandable. His command was engaged in an attrition campaign against German cities, flying massive raids that cost dozens of aircraft nightly. The proposed dam operation would require specially modified Lancasters, his most capable bombers, removed from the regular bomber stream. It would demand extensive training for precision low-level flying, and it depended on an experimental weapon that had never been tested under combat conditions. But Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, saw strategic potential. If the dams could be breached during spring when reservoir levels peaked, the resulting floods would devastate Ruhr industry for months. Portal overruled Harris, and on February 26, 1943, ordered that 30 Lancaster bombers be allocated for modification. The timeline was absurdly compressed. The raid had to occur in May, when reservoir levels were highest, giving Wallace just 10 weeks to finalize the weapon design, conduct full-scale tests, and manufacture sufficient bombs. The aircraft modifications had to be completed, a squadron had to be formed and trained, and absolutely everything had to work perfectly on the first attempt, because there would be no second chance. The weapon that emerged from frantic development was designated Vickers Type 464, codenamed Upkeep. The final configuration was cylindrical rather than spherical. Testing showed that spherical casings shattered on water impact, but the inner cylinder continued bouncing as intended. Eliminating the outer sphere simplified manufacturing and reduced weight. The finished Upkeep measured 60 inches long and 50 inches in diameter. It weighed 9,250 pounds total, 6,600 pounds of Torpex explosive in a steel casing. 3 hydrostatic pistols, identical to those used in depth charges, would detonate the weapon at 30 feet depth. A backup chemical delay fuse provided redundancy. If dropped over land, a self-destruct mechanism would detonate it to prevent German examination. The backspin mechanism was elegantly simple. A Vickers Jassy hydraulic motor, powered by the Lancaster's hydraulic system, drove a belt connected to the bomb's cradle. Activation occurred 10 minutes before target arrival, spinning the 4.5-ton weapon to 500 RPM. The gyroscopic forces created significant flight control challenges. The Lancaster wanted to drop and yaw as the spinning mass affected its balance. Pilots learned to compensate, but the 10-minute spin-up period was necessary to allow the aircraft to stabilize before the bomb run. The modified Lancasters, designated Type 464 provisioning or Lancaster BI-I Special, underwent extensive modifications at Woodford Aerodrome. The bomb bay doors were removed entirely. Upkeep was too large to fit inside the fuselage and had to be carried externally in specially designed caliper arm cradles. The mid-upper gun turret was removed to save weight, its gunner reassigned to the front turret. This left the aircraft dangerously vulnerable to fighter attack from above, but reduced weight was essential for the low-altitude mission profile. The aiming system was ingeniously simple. Spotlights mounted in the nose and tail, angled to converge at exactly 60 feet, would create a figure-8 pattern on the water when the aircraft was at correct altitude. For distance measurement, bomb aimer Flight Sergeant John Pulford devised a triangular wooden sight. Looking through one corner while aligning the other two with towers on the dam indicated the proper 425-yard release point. Some crews found the device awkward and improvised alternatives using chinograph marks on the perspex and lengths of string, but the principle remained identical. Final testing occurred on May 13, 1943, just 3 days before the planned raid. A live upkeep was dropped from a modified Lancaster 5 miles off Broadstairs, Kent. The bomb bounced 7 times across approximately 800 yards, sank and detonated at depth, exactly as Wallace predicted. The test validated the mathematics. Now human beings would have to execute the theory under combat conditions. On March 21, 1943, Air Vice Marshal the Honourable Ralph Cochrane summoned Wing Commander Guy Gibson to his headquarters at RAF Grantham. Gibson, 24 years old, had just completed his 3rd operational tour, 173 sorties, including missions over every major German city. He was exhausted, entitled to rest, and expecting a posting away from combat operations. Cochrane offered him something different: command of a new squadron forming for a special operation. The target would remain classified until shortly before the mission. The operation would be exceptionally dangerous. Gibson's response was immediate acceptance. Squadron X, later redesignated 617 Squadron, assembled at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. Gibson hand-selected crews from across Bomber Command, experienced pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, flight engineers and gunners pulled from their squadrons specifically for their skill. The criteria were specific. Pilots needed low-level flying experience, bomb aimers required exceptional precision, everyone needed demonstrated courage and competence. Among those selected were some of Bomber Command's most capable airmen. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood had flown 48 operations. Squadron leader Henry Maudsley had 50 missions. Pilot Officer Les Knight was a skilled Australian pilot. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, Flight Lieutenant David Shannon, Flight Sergeant Ken Brown, all were veterans multiple times over. The average age in 617 Squadron was 22 years old. They were children by modern standards, but children who had already survived what most did not: a full tour of 30 operations against German defenses that destroyed 1 in 20 attacking bombers. Training began in late March, without crews knowing their ultimate objective. The regimen was unlike anything in standard Bomber Command operations: continuous low-level flying, often at 150 feet or less, navigating by visual landmarks at night. They flew over reservoirs in the Midlands, Derwent and Howden dams in Derbyshire, chosen because they resembled the German targets. The flying was extraordinarily dangerous. At 60 feet altitude, traveling at 240 miles per hour, any pilot error meant instant death. Flight Lieutenant William Astle's Lancaster clipped power lines during a training exercise and crashed, killing the entire crew. Other crews had near misses with high-tension lines, church steeples, and terrain features invisible in darkness. The crews complained bitterly about the difficulty of judging altitude over water at night. Human depth perception fails over dark water. There are no reference points, no shadows, no visual cues. The spotlights solved this problem, but their installation wasn't completed until mid-April, leaving crews to develop techniques through trial and error. Security was absolute. Ground crews modified the aircraft without knowing the weapon they would carry. Aircrew trained without knowing the target. Even Gibson didn't receive full briefing until May 15, the day before the operation. This compartmentalization was essential. German intelligence monitored British bomber operations intensively, and any leak could doom the raid. On May 13, the same day Wallace conducted final testing of upkeep, Gibson gathered his squadron commanders and revealed the target: German dams in the Ruhr Valley. The reactions ranged from excitement to apprehension. They would be flying into the most heavily defended region of Germany at night at an altitude where flak guns could hardly miss. Success required perfect execution under impossible conditions. 2 days later, on May 15, the full squadron received briefing. Operations Officer Squadron Leader Henry Young spread maps across the briefing room and explained the mission in detail. 3 dams were primary targets: Möhne, Eder and Sorpe. 3 more, Ennepe, Lister and Diemel, were secondary targets if time and aircraft remained. The raid would be organized in 3 waves. Gibson would lead Formation 1, 9 aircraft attacking the Möhne Dam first, then any survivors would proceed to the Eder. Formation 2, 5 aircraft, would take a northern route directly to the Sorpe Dam, which required a different attack method due to its earthen construction. Formation 3, 5 aircraft would serve as reserves, taking off later and available for any target requiring additional attacks. The briefing included sobering intelligence about German defenses. The Möhne was defended by multiple 20mm and 37mm flak batteries positioned in towers on the dam itself. Searchlights covered the approach. Barrage balloon cables had been reported, though recent reconnaissance suggested they'd been removed. The flight route crossed 400 miles of occupied Europe, including numerous flak concentrations that had to be avoided through precise navigation. Gibson concluded the briefing with characteristic understatement. "This is a tough job. Some of us won't come back. But if we do it right, we'll hurt Jerry badly." 86 Tromflens Menedrix during 3 stretches. For 21:10 hours, on May 16, 1943, the first Lancasters of Formation 2 began taking off from RAF Scampton. They would fly the longest route, north across the North Sea, entering Europe near the Frisian Islands, then southeast to the Sorpe Dam. Their departure time was staggered to ensure all formations arrived at their targets during the narrow window when moonlight would be optimal for the visual bombing technique. 28 minutes later, at 21:39 hours, Gibson led Formation 1 into the night. 9 Lancasters, each carrying a single 9,250-pound bomb spinning at 500 RPM, climbed to 1,000 feet and set course for the English coast. Behind them, Formation 3 remained on the ground. They would take off after midnight, providing reinforcement wherever needed. The outbound flight was conducted at extreme low level to avoid German radar. Pilots maintained 100 feet or less, navigating by moonlight and visual landmarks while avoiding flak concentrations marked on their charts. The technique required absolute concentration. At 240 miles per hour, 100 feet provides roughly 1 second between recognizing an obstacle and impact. Flight Lieutenant William Astle, flying Lancaster AJGB in Gibson's formation, never made it across the Netherlands. His aircraft struck high-tension power lines near Roosendaal and crashed, killing all 7 crew members. The massive explosion suggested the upkeep had detonated, obliterating any remains. Flight Lieutenant Robert Barlow, leading the southern element of Formation 2, suffered a similar fate. His Lancaster hit power lines at Haldern near Ries and crashed on land. The upkeep separated but didn't detonate. German investigators would later recover it intact, providing them with detailed technical intelligence about the weapon's construction. Flight Lieutenant Harlow's Munro's Lancaster took flak damage over the Wadden Islands, piercing the aircraft's skin and severing hydraulic lines. With his radio and intercom inoperable and unable to maintain altitude, Munro made the agonizing decision to abort and return to base, the first aircraft back with its bombs still aboard. These losses occurred before any aircraft reached their targets. The crews pushing onward into Germany knew that friends were already dead, that more would die, and that their own survival was increasingly improbable with each passing minute over occupied territory. At 00:15 hours on May 17, Gibson's formation reached the Möhne Reservoir. The moon was bright, the dam clearly visible, and flak positions immediately alert. Gibson made a wide circuit, studying the approach, then transmitted to his crew. "This is it, boys. Let's go." He pushed AJG into the attack dive, dropping towards 60 feet while accelerating to exactly 232 miles per hour. In the nose, bomb aimer Flight Sergeant John Spafford called corrections. Left, left, steady. The spotlights created their figure eight on the dark water, confirming altitude. Spafford aligned his triangular sight with the dam towers. The flak batteries opened fire. Front gunner Flight Sergeant George Deering and rear gunner Flight Lieutenant Richard Trevor returned fire with their 303 Browning machine guns, 77mm rounds, inadequate against fortified positions, but forcing gun crews to take cover momentarily. Every second of suppression mattered when flying through a firestorm. Bomb gone. Spafford's shout coincided with Gibson pulling the release. The upkeep separated from its cradles, backspin still at 500 RPM, and struck water. It bounced once, twice, 3 times across the reservoir surface, each impact sending up massive plumes of water. Gibson climbed steeply, corkscrewing away from the dam while watching in his mirror. The bomb struck the dam wall, sank, and 3 hydrostatic pistols detonated 6,600 pounds of Torpex at exactly 30 feet depth. The explosion created a massive water column, white froth erupting hundreds of feet upward, momentarily obscuring the entire dam. When the spray settled, the structure appeared intact. "Wasn't quite right," Gibson transmitted. "Next attack, go in." Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, flying AJM Mother, began his approach. The flak gunners, now fully alert, concentrated fire on the approaching Lancaster. Hopgood held course despite taking multiple hits. The port outer engine burst into flames. The wing root was holed. Hydraulic fluid streamed behind the aircraft, but Hopgood continued the run. At 400 yards, bomb aimer Flight Sergeant John Fraser released the upkeep. It bounced across the water and struck the dam, but Hopgood's Lancaster, trailing fire and smoke, was mortally wounded. The aircraft climbed to 500 feet, giving the crew seconds to bail out. 3 escaped: Fraser the bomb aimer, Pilot Officer John Bircher, and rear gunner Pilot Officer Tony Bircher. 4 others, including Hopgood, died when AJM exploded. The second upkeep had again failed to breach the dam. Flight Lieutenant Harold Mick Martin, an Australian pilot flying AJP Popsy, made the third attack. Martin flew through the debris of Hopgood's explosion, through concentrated flak, released at precisely the calculated point. His bomb bounced, struck, sank, detonated. The dam remained standing. Squadron leader Henry Young, AJA Apple, attacked fourth. Perfect approach, perfect release, perfect detonation. Still the dam held. Gibson, watching 4 attacks produce no visible damage, reconsidered tactics. The flak positions were becoming more accurate as gunners refined their aim. The next aircraft needed covering fire to have any chance. Gibson flew his now unarmed Lancaster alongside Flight Lieutenant David Maltby's AJJ Johnny during Maltby's attack run, drawing fire away from the bomb-carrying aircraft. Maltby's bomb aimer, Sergeant Vivian Nicholson, released at the optimal point. The upkeep bounced 7 times, exactly as Wallace predicted, struck the dam, sank, and detonated. This time, when the water column settled, something was different. A section of the dam's crest had collapsed. Water was pouring through a gap perhaps 10 feet wide. Gibson circled, watching the gap widen under the hydraulic pressure of 140 million tons of water pushing against weakened masonry. The breach grew wider, 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. The water flow accelerated, undermining more structure, collapsing additional sections in a cascading failure. At 0049 hours, 21 minutes after the first attack, the Mona Dam was breached. A section approximately 250 feet wide and 292 feet deep had collapsed. Water poured through at an estimated rate of 8,000 cubic meters per second. A wall of water 33 feet high, traveling at 15 miles per hour into the valleys below. Gibson transmitted to base. Goner. The code word confirming success. Then he gathered his surviving aircraft. 3 Lancasters remained operational from the initial 5, and set course for the Eder Dam, 50 miles southeast. The Eder Dam sat in a narrow valley surrounded by heavily wooded hills rising 1,000 feet above the reservoir. Unlike the Möhne, it had no flak defences. German planners had deemed the approach too difficult for attacking aircraft. They were partially right. Gibson arrived at the Eder at approximately 0130 hours. Studying the approach, he immediately understood why the Germans considered it unassailable. The attack run required flying over high ground, diving steeply into the valley, leveling at 60 feet over the water while still losing altitude from the dive, releasing the weapon, then climbing steeply to avoid hills on the far side. All of this at night, using visual references barely visible in darkness. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon, AJL Leather, attempted the first attack. He made 6 unsuccessful runs, unable to achieve the proper altitude, speed, and heading simultaneously. The confined valley's turbulence made precise flying nearly impossible. After the 6th attempt, Shannon pulled away, frustrated and low on fuel. Squadron leader Henry Maudslay, AJZ Zebra, attempted next. On his 3rd approach, everything aligned, altitude correct, speed precise, heading steady. Bomb aimer flying officer Urquhart released the upkeep. It bounced, struck the dam, but the timing was fractionally off. The bomb hit slightly late and detonated on impact rather than sinking properly. The explosion occurred directly beneath Maudslay's Lancaster as it passed over the dam. The blast damaged the aircraft severely, exact extent unknown, but the subsequent radio transmissions suggested catastrophic structural failure. Maudslay attempted to fly back to England, but crashed near Emmerich, Germany. All 7 crew members were killed. Shannon attempted again after Maudslay's disaster. On his 7th approach, he achieved the precise parameters. The upkeep bounced, struck, sank, and detonated. The explosion created a massive water column, but when it settled, the dam appeared intact. Flight Lieutenant Les Knight, an Australian pilot flying AJN Nutt, made the final attack with the last remaining bomb from Gibson's formation. Knight's approach was perfect, altitude exact, speed precise, release point optimal. His upkeep bounced 7 times across the reservoir, struck the dam dead center, sank while maintaining contact with the face, and detonated at exactly 30 feet depth. The explosion created a breach. Like the Möhne, the initial failure was small, perhaps 15 feet wide, but hydraulic pressure immediately began widening the gap. Within minutes, a section approximately 230 feet wide had collapsed, releasing another 200 million tons of water into the valley below. At 0152 hours, Gibson transmitted dinghy, the code word confirming the Eder was breached. 2 dams destroyed, 340 million tons of water flooding into the Ruhr Valley and Eder Valley. Gibson gathered his surviving aircraft and set course for home. His fuel was critically low, his aircraft damaged by flak and flying debris, his crew exhausted from over 4 hours of combat flying. But the mission's primary objectives were accomplished.
The Sun and the Toss.
While Gibson's formation attacked the Möhne and Eder, Formation 2 faced different challenges at the Sorp Dam. This structure was fundamentally different, an earthen dam rather than masonry, 2,300 feet long and 210 feet high, constructed of compressed clay and earth rather than concrete and stone. The attack method was necessarily different. The Sorp couldn't be breached by underwater explosion against its face. The earthen construction would absorb the blast. Instead, aircraft had to fly along the dam's length, dropping their upkeep without backspin directly onto the dam crest. This required flying along a narrow valley, threading between hills, releasing at the precise moment to hit the dam's crown. Multiple hits in the same location were essential. One bomb would crater the crest, but not breach it. Of Formation 2's 5 aircraft, only 2 reached the SORP. Flight Lieutenant Les Munro had aborted early with damage. Pilot Officer Vernon Byers crashed en route, cause unknown. Flight Lieutenant Robert Barlow struck power lines. That left just 2 aircraft. Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy, an American flying with the RAF in AJT Tommy, and Flight Sergeant Ken Brown in AJF Freddy. McCarthy arrived at the SORP at 0046 hours and began attempting his attack runs. The valley approach was even more difficult than the Eder Hills on both sides, no room for error, requiring flight at treetop level while maintaining precise heading. McCarthy made 9 approaches before achieving the parameters he needed. His upkeep struck the dam crest and exploded, creating a crater approximately 30 feet deep, visible damage but no breach. Brown arrived later and made a single attack, adding his upkeep to the crater McCarthy had created. The combined explosions cratered the crest extensively, but the earthen structure absorbed the damage. Water was leaking through, but the dam held. Formation 3, the reserve aircraft, suffered grievously. Of 5 aircraft, only 2 reached any target. Flight Lieutenant Warner Otley's Lancaster was shot down by flak en route. Flight Sergeant William Townsend attacked the Ennepe Dam, or possibly the Bever Dam. Historical evidence is unclear, without success. Pilot Officer Louis Burpee was shot down by flak near Gilsey Region Airfield. Flight Sergeant Cyril Anderson attacked the SORP Dam with minimal effect. Flight Sergeant Kenneth Brown made multiple attacks on the SORP without breaching it. By 0315 hours, all surviving aircraft were heading home. The return flight was as dangerous as the outbound. German defenses were now fully alert, and crews exhausted from hours of high-stress combat flying still had to navigate 400 miles over occupied territory while avoiding flak concentrations. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon's Lancaster was so badly damaged that the crew debated bailing out over Holland versus attempting to reach England. Shannon chose to continue, nursing the wounded aircraft across the North Sea on 3 engines with damaged hydraulics. They landed at Scampton at 0420 hours, the aircraft immediately written off as irreparable. The final aircraft landed at 0615 hours on May 17. Of 19 Lancasters that departed, 11 returned. 8 were lost, 6 shot down by flak, 1 crashed into power lines, 1 crashed on the return flight. Of 133 aircrew, 53 were killed, and 3 became prisoners of war. The casualty rate was 42% of aircraft and 40% of aircrew losses that would be unsustainable in regular operations. The flood and the reckoning. At 0125 hours on May 17, as Gibson's formation was attacking the Eder, the floodwaters from the Mone breach reached the first town, Neheim, 7 miles downstream. A 33-foot wall of water traveling at 15 Montfort-Eitring obliterated everything in its path. The flood continued westward, following the Ruhr River valley, destroying everything within its reach. The towns of Wickede, Echthausen, and Frundenberg were inundated. Railroad bridges collapsed. Roads were washed away. Power stations were flooded. Coal mines filled with water. The human cost was catastrophic. Official German records state at least 1,650 people were killed, 1,294 from the Mone breach alone. The actual number may have been higher. Many victims were not German civilians, but forced laborers and prisoners of war housed in camps near the river. Russian, Polish, French, and other nationalities working in German factories. These deaths were not counted in initial casualty figures. The Ida flood was less destructive to industry, but equally devastating to civilian populations. Water cascading through the breach destroyed 11 factories, 25 road bridges, 30 railway bridges, and thousands of hectares of farmland. The flood reached Kassel, 22 miles from the dam, where it caused extensive damage to the city's electrical system. German response was immediate and comprehensive. Within hours, 7,000 construction workers were diverted from Atlantic Wall construction to begin dam repairs. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, visited the Möhne breach and ordered maximum priority for restoration. Slave laborers from concentration camps were transported to work sites. Emergency pumps were installed to clear flooded mines. The speed of German reconstruction was remarkable. The Möhne breach was temporarily sealed within weeks, though full reconstruction took until September. The Ida was similarly repaired rapidly. By late summer, both dams were operational again, though at reduced capacity. The strategic effect of the raid was debated immediately and remains controversial. Water supply to Ruhr industry was disrupted significantly in May and June 1943. Steel production dropped to approximately 25% of normal levels. Power generation was affected. Coal production fell by 400,000 tons. Transportation was disrupted by destroyed bridges and flooded rail lines. But within 3 months, production had recovered to near normal levels. The dams were rebuilt, the mines were pumped out, alternative water sources were developed. German industry proved remarkably resilient. Barnes-Wallis, reviewing the results, was disappointed. He had hoped the breaches would cause permanent strategic damage. Instead, they produced temporary disruption. More critically, Bomber Command failed to follow up with conventional attacks during the repair period when the dams were vulnerable. Additional bombing could have prevented reconstruction. Harris, who had opposed the raid from the start, declined to risk his bombers on follow-up missions. The heroes and the myth. When the surviving crews landed at Scampton on May 17, they were greeted as heroes. Within hours, BBC Radio was broadcasting news of the raid, carefully censored to avoid revealing technical details, but emphasizing the successful breaches. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the Dambusters. Newsreel footage of the damaged dams, taken by reconnaissance Spitfires, appeared in cinemas nationwide. The propaganda value was immense. After years of inconclusive strategic bombing campaigns, here was a visible, dramatic success. Dams breached, floods unleashed, German industry disrupted. The technical innovation, the bouncing bomb, captured public imagination. The human story, young men conducting precision attacks at impossible altitude under heavy fire, provided the heroism narrative that Britain desperately needed. King George VI visited Scampton 10 days after the raid to congratulate the survivors. Wing Commander Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. 33 other aircrew received awards, including Distinguished Service Orders, Distinguished Flying Crosses, Conspicuous Gallantry Medals, and Distinguished Flying Medals. Gibson became an immediate celebrity. He toured the United States promoting Anglo-American cooperation, met President Roosevelt, and gave hundreds of interviews. His book, Enemy Coast Ahead, written in 1944, became a bestseller. But celebrity couldn't satisfy a man who defined himself by combat. Gibson requested return to operations and was killed on September 19, 1944, when his Mosquito crashed over Holland during a raid on Wright. He was 26 years old. 617 Squadron continued operations as a specialist precision bombing unit. They adopted the motto, Après moi le déluge, after me the flood, a reference both to their founding mission and their continued role in precision attacks. The squadron pioneered use of Barnes-Wallis's earthquake bombs, the 12,000-pound Tall Boy and the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, which were used to destroy hardened targets, including the battleship Tirpitz, V-2 rocket sites, and the Bielefeld railway viaduct. The 1955 film The Dambusters, starring Richard Todd as Gibson and Michael Redgrave as Wallace, cemented the raid's legendary status. The film portrayed the operation as a triumph of British ingenuity and courage, which it was, while glossing over the civilian casualties and the limited strategic impact. The stirring Dambusters march by composer Eric Coates became one of the most recognizable pieces of British music. But the film also perpetuated inaccuracies. The bouncing bomb effects were created using footage of early spherical prototypes because the actual cylindrical upkeep's backspin mechanism remained classified. The film showed the bombs clearly bouncing across water when in reality the spinning made them less visible. Gibson's dog, killed the day before the raid, was given a racially offensive name that reflected 1940s attitudes but is rightfully condemned today. The technical legacy. The upkeep weapon was never used again operationally. All remaining bombs, approximately 40, were dumped into the North Sea without their detonation devices before war's end, as their condition had begun to deteriorate. The concept of bouncing bombs attacking dams was abandoned. The specific circumstances that made Operation Chastise possible were unlikely to recur. But the technical principles influenced future weapons development. Barnes-Wallace's understanding of kinetic energy and structural failure informed his subsequent designs. The Tall Boy bomb, 12,000 pounds, streamlined for high-velocity impact, was designed to penetrate deep before detonating, creating earthquake effects that collapsed structures from within. The principle was similar to upkeep: exploit structural weaknesses through precisely placed explosions rather than relying on surface damage. The Grand Slam, 22,000 pounds, dropped from 25,000 feet, achieving near-sonic velocity on impact, represented the ultimate expression of Wallace's philosophy. These earthquake bombs destroyed V-2 rocket bunkers, submarine pens, and the Bielefeld viaduct when conventional bombs had failed repeatedly. The success of these weapons vindicated Wallace's approach. Understand the physics of your target, design a weapon exploiting specific vulnerabilities, and accept that one precisely placed bomb can accomplish what thousands of conventional bombs cannot. The low-level precision flying techniques developed for Chastise influenced post-war military aviation. The understanding that skilled crews in modified aircraft could attack targets considered invulnerable to conventional bombing shaped special operations doctrine. Modern precision-guided munitions are conceptual descendants of Wallace's approach, using technology to place explosives exactly where they'll cause maximum damage rather than relying on mass bombing. The spotlights for altitude technique, while primitive, demonstrated that simple solutions to complex problems often work better than sophisticated ones. Modern terrain following radar and laser altimeters serve the same function with greater precision, but the principle, accurate altitude information, enables low-level flight, remains unchanged. Perhaps most significantly, Operation Chastise demonstrated that technical innovation combined with tactical audacity could accomplish missions that conventional doctrine deemed impossible. This lesson influenced special operations thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The raid on Entebbe, the Sante rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, the Bin Laden raid, all reflected the Chastise principle that unconventional problems require unconventional solutions. For decades, the Dambusters story focused almost exclusively on the heroism of the RAF crews. The 53 airmen who died were properly honoured, their names inscribed on memorials, their families provided with pensions, their sacrifices commemorated annually. The civilian casualties received far less attention. British propaganda during and immediately after the war downplayed or ignored the deaths of 1,650 people in the floods. Many were dismissed as German casualties in an era when enemy civilian deaths were considered inevitable collateral damage. The fact that many victims were actually forced labourers and prisoners of war was conveniently ignored. Modern historical scholarship has corrected this imbalance. The full human cost of Operation Chastise includes not just the RAF aircrew, but the civilians, forced and free, who drowned in the floods. A memorial near the Möhne Dam, erected in 2013 on the 70th anniversary, acknowledges all victims without distinction of nationality or circumstance. The forced labourers who died deserve particular recognition. They were victims twice over, enslaved by the Nazi regime, then killed by Allied action intended to damage that same regime. Their deaths raise uncomfortable questions about strategic bombing ethics that have no simple answers. Would the crews have proceeded with the raid if they'd known the full human cost? Most veterans interviewed decades later said yes. The strategic objective justified the casualties, including civilians. But several also expressed discomfort with the forced labourer deaths, stating they wished they'd known at the time so they could have weighed the moral implications themselves. Squadron leader George Holden, who flew in Formation 3, reflected in a 1990 interview, "We knew civilians would die. We accepted that as part of war, but we thought we were hitting German industry and military targets. If we'd known that a large percentage of casualties would be prisoners and forced labourers, people the Nazis had enslaved, I think some of us would have felt differently. Not about the mission's necessity, but about how we remembered it afterwards. The rebuilding of the dams required additional forced labour. Concentration camp prisoners transported specifically for the emergency reconstruction. They worked under brutal conditions with minimal food, inadequate shelter, and frequent beatings. Deaths among reconstruction workers are poorly documented, but historians estimate at least several hundred prisoners died during the repair operations. These deaths are attributable to Nazi brutality rather than Allied action, but they were consequences of the raid nonetheless. The full human cost of Operation Chastise includes not just the immediate flood victims, but those who died repairing the damage under slave labour conditions. Strategic bombing's effectiveness remains one of World War II's most contentious historical debates. Operation Chastise occupies a peculiar position in this debate. Simultaneously celebrated as an iconic success and criticised as strategically insignificant. The pro-Chastise argument emphasises the immediate impact: water supply disrupted, power generation reduced, coal production affected, transportation paralysed. These effects, while temporary, occurred during a critical period when Germany was fully mobilising for total war. Any disruption of war production saved Allied lives by delaying or reducing German military capability. Additionally, the psychological impact on German leadership was significant. The raid demonstrated that major infrastructure targets previously considered invulnerable could be attacked successfully. This forced Germany to divert resources, personnel, flak guns, early warning systems to defend other dams and infrastructure throughout the Reich. These resources came from other defence needs, potentially weakening Germany's ability to defend against conventional bombing raids. The propaganda value to Allied morale was undeniable. In spring 1943, the war's outcome remained uncertain. The Soviet Union was locked in desperate combat on the Eastern Front. The U-boat war in the Atlantic threatened Britain's survival. Allied strategic bombing was producing questionable results at horrific cost. Operation Chastise provided a clear dramatic success that boosted morale when it was desperately needed. The counter-argument emphasises the limited lasting damage. Within 3 months, both dams were operational again. German production recovered rapidly. The resources devoted to the raid, modified aircraft, specialized weapons, extensive training, produced only temporary results. Regular strategic bombing missions during the same period destroyed more German production capacity at lower cost. Furthermore, the raid diverted Bomber Command's best crews from regular operations for 2 months. Those 19 Lancaster crews flying normal missions during March-May 1943 would have dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on German targets. The opportunity cost of Operation Chastise was therefore substantial. Most critically, Bomber Command failed to exploit the temporary success. Follow-up raids during the repair period could have prevented reconstruction, or at least delayed it significantly. But Harris, still skeptical of precision attacks on infrastructure, declined to allocate bombers for follow-up missions. This failure to exploit success turned a potentially decisive blow into a temporary inconvenience. Modern military historians tend toward nuanced assessments. Operation Chastise was tactically brilliant, operationally successful, and strategically limited. It demonstrated technical innovation, tactical skill, and operational courage. But measured against the cost, 8 aircraft, 53 airmen, 1,650 civilians dead, and 2 months of training, the strategic impact was modest. Professor Richard Overy, a leading World War II historian, argues that Chastise's true significance was not strategic, but doctrinal. The raid proved that precision attacks against infrastructure were possible, given proper weapons, training, and conditions. This lesson influenced post-war military thinking about strategic bombing far more than the immediate tactical results affected German production. For the 80 aircrew who survived Operation Chastise, the raid was both the defining moment of their lives and a burden they carried until death. Many flew additional operations with 617 Squadron or other units. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon completed 90 total operations, 3 full tours. Flight Lieutenant Les Knight flew on until September 1943, when his Lancaster was shot down over Italy. He survived the crash, but died of injuries. Pilot Officer Jeff Rice flew until shot down and becoming a prisoner of war. Many others continued operational flying until killed, captured, or their luck finally ran out. Several survivors became instructors, passing their hard-won knowledge to new crews. The low-level flying techniques they'd mastered at Scampton were taught to countless bomber crews, potentially saving lives when those crews had to conduct low-level attacks or evade fighters by flying at treetop level. After the war, survivors struggled with survivor's guilt, the persistent question of why they lived when friends died. Squadron leader Henry Maudsley, who died at the Ida, had been best man at Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon's wedding. Shannon carried that loss for decades. "Mick was a better pilot than me," Shannon said in an interview. "Why did I survive and he didn't? There's no good answer, just luck, timing, and the fact that war is utterly random in who it takes." The celebrity that came with Dambusters' fame was uncomfortable for many. They were interviewed repeatedly, asked to attend commemorations, expected to be heroes decades after the events. Some embraced this role, happy to honor their fallen comrades by keeping their memory alive. Others found it exhausting and preferred to move on with their lives. George Johnny Johnson, the last surviving Dambusters participant who died in December 2022 at age 101, became the raid's living memory in his final years. He attended countless commemorations, gave hundreds of interviews, and worked tirelessly to ensure that both the successes and costs of Operation Chastise were properly remembered. Johnson was particularly insistent that civilian casualties be acknowledged. "We did what we were ordered to do, and we believed it was necessary," he said in one of his final interviews. "But we can't pretend that only Germans died in those floods. Innocent people died, prisoners died. That's the reality of strategic bombing, and we have to face it honestly, even while honoring the crews who didn't come home." Today, multiple memorials mark Operation Chastise's legacy. At RAF Scampton, now closed as an active base, a memorial garden honors 617 Squadron's history from the Dambusters through to the squadron's modern operations, flying tornadoes. The names of the 53 men lost on May 17, 1943, are inscribed in stone. At Woodhall Spa, Lincolnshire, where 617 Squadron moved after Scampton, the Petwood Hotel, which served as the officers' mess during the war, houses a small museum with Dambusters artifacts. The bar where crews drank before missions remains largely unchanged, a time capsule preserving the atmosphere of those desperate years. In Germany, the Möhne Dam has become a tourist attraction. The rebuilt dam looks largely identical to the original, though constructed with modern materials. A museum near the dam tells the story from German perspective, acknowledging the engineering achievement of the British attack while emphasizing the civilian casualties and the suffering caused by the floods. The Eder Dam similarly attracts visitors interested in the raid's history. Both dams include memorial plaques acknowledging the 1943 attacks and the deaths they caused. German, Allied, and forced laborer victims remembered together. At Reichswald Forest Cemetery near Cleve, Germany, 36 of the 53 dead aircrew are buried in Commonwealth war graves plots. Their headstones are identical to thousands of others, simple, dignified markers in rows that stretch across the cemetery. Walking among them, it's impossible not to reflect on how young they were, most in their early 20s, several only 19 years old. The remaining dead are scattered, some buried at other military cemeteries, some with no known grave, listed instead on the memorial at Runnymede commemorating the missing. Their names are joined by those of 20,000 other Commonwealth aircrew who have no known graves, testimony to the brutal attrition of the bomber war. Barnes Wallis, who lived until 1979, designed numerous weapons and aircraft in subsequent decades, but never escaped the shadow of the bouncing bomb. He was knighted in 1968 for his engineering contributions. In later years, he expressed conflicted feelings about his weapons work, proud of the technical achievements, troubled by the deaths they caused. In a 1972 interview, Wallis said, "I designed upkeep to destroy dams and disrupt German production. I succeeded technically, but I'm haunted by the deaths, not just the RAF crews, though God knows that's burden enough, but the civilians in those valleys who drowned. They weren't Nazis, many weren't even Germans. They were just people who happened to live downstream from structures I showed the RAF how to destroy. That's not something you ever fully reconcile." Operation Chastise represents a paradox, an operation that was simultaneously a technical triumph and a strategic disappointment, a tactical masterpiece and a humanitarian catastrophe, an inspiration for generations and a cautionary tale about the costs of war. The raid succeeded in every immediate objective. The dams were breached through innovative weapons technology and exceptional flying skill. The Ruhr Valley was flooded, disrupting German production. British morale received a boost when it desperately needed one. All of this was accomplished by 133 young men in 19 modified bombers, executing a mission that most experts had declared impossible. But the lasting impact was less than hoped. German industry recovered quickly. The dams were rebuilt, production resumed. The strategic advantage was temporary rather than decisive. And the human cost, 53 RAF dead, 1,650 civilians drowned, raised ethical questions that remain uncomfortable 80 years later. Perhaps the raid's true legacy lies not in what it accomplished immediately, but in what it represented. The idea that precision, innovation, and courage could overcome obstacles that brute force could not. This principle influenced countless subsequent operations, from Wallis's earthquake bombs destroying targets that had resisted thousands of conventional bombs, to modern precision-guided munitions enabling destruction of specific targets with minimal collateral damage. The bouncing bomb itself was a dead end, never used again, its specific application too narrow for other targets. But the thinking that created it, analyzing a target's physics, designing a weapon exploiting specific vulnerabilities, training crews to employ that weapon with extreme precision, that thinking revolutionized warfare. Modern conflict is dominated by precision weapons. GPS-guided bombs striking targets within feet of aim points, cruise missiles navigating complex routes to specific buildings, drones loitering for hours before striking individual vehicles. All of these descend conceptually from Barnes-Wallace's insight that understanding your target's physics enables more effective destruction than simply dropping larger bombs. But precision comes with its own ethical burdens. When weapons can strike specific targets reliably, the decision about what to strike and what the acceptable collateral damage might be becomes more consequential. The civilians who drowned below the Mona Dam died because precision weapons worked as designed. The dam was breached exactly as intended, and the floods were inevitable consequences. This raises questions that remain relevant. Is it ethical to attack infrastructure targets when civilian casualties are certain? How do we balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns? Who bears moral responsibility when precision weapons cause the deaths of non-combatants? The designers, the commanders who order their use, the crews who employ them, or all of them together? Operation Chastise offers no comfortable answers. It demonstrates that even surgical strikes, the 1940s equivalent of modern precision attacks, have human costs that extend far beyond the immediate target. The 53 RAF aircrew knew the risks they faced and accepted them voluntarily. The 1,650 civilians in the valleys had no choice. As the last survivors died and living memory faded into history, the Dambusters raid increasingly became mythology, a story of courage and innovation, heroes and sacrifice. That mythology contains truth but obscures complexity. The full truth is more complicated and more human. 133 young men attempted something extraordinary because their commanders ordered it and they believed it necessary. 53 died in the attempt. Those who survived carried the experience until death, pride and trauma inseparable, intertwined, permanent. They succeeded tactically, they failed strategically. They demonstrated technical brilliance and paid human costs that in retrospect were perhaps too high for the results achieved. But in May 1943, facing a war whose outcome remained uncertain, they climbed into modified bombers carrying experimental weapons and flew into the most heavily defended region of Germany to attack targets considered invulnerable. They did this knowing that survival was improbable, that success was uncertain, and that failure meant drowning in a shot-down aircraft or burning in an explosion or simply disappearing into darkness and being listed as missing. They did it anyway. That courage, not the technical innovation, not the tactical success, not even the strategic impact, is what demands remembrance. The Dambusters raid was remarkable not because it perfectly achieved its objectives, but because ordinary people attempted something extraordinary when their nation needed it, accepting costs that most of us cannot imagine. The bouncing bombs are gone, dumped into the North Sea, or destroyed in tests. Their brief moment of utility ended. The dams were rebuilt and still stand. The floodwaters receded decades ago, leaving only scars in the landscape and names carved on memorials. What remains is memory of innovation born from desperation.